So we're going to start our Bible study on the book of Galatians tonight. And as we go through the rest of the story, and as we go through the rest of the book of Galatians, we're going to be looking at the what. But I always like to, before we dive into anything, especially when you're studying a specific book of the Bible, especially one of the letters that Paul wrote, is I like to look at the who, where, when, and why parts of it before you really dive into the what. Because I think those parts really help set up what the what really means. So that's what we're going to do today. So who was Paul talking to? Paul was talking to the group of churches that lived in the region known as Galatia. There wasn't a city called Galatia. There was a region called Galatia. It was actually where the Gauls had moved down from the north and had settled there before they got conquered by the Romans. But that was what the region was called. And this is actually a picture of what that kind of looks like. But if you look here, this is actually where the region of Galatia actually was. So as you can see, it was very, very large. But the churches Paul was most likely talking to and referring to were these four churches: Antioch, Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe right there. Those are the four churches Paul was most likely referring to the most, because those were the churches that he visited on his first missionary journey. So now we've hit the who and the where. The when would have been around 48 to 55 AD. This is one of the first letters that Paul probably ever wrote. This is one of the first letters that we have in the Bible for sure, one of the oldest letters of Paul's that we have in the Bible. This actually takes place probably about 15 years after Jesus had been crucified and then the resurrection happened. So Christianity as a religion, as a group of people, was still very, very young at this point. And Paul was very, very young in his Christian journey. He's only been a Christian probably at this point about 10 to 12 years, which I know might seem like a really long time, but in the grand scheme of things, that was still a really short amount of time. So to kind of set up this book of the Bible, what I want to do is kind of build up to what is going on, why Paul is going to be talking about some of the things that he's talking about. Because in this letter, this is possibly one of the most passionate, I guess is a good way to say it. Some people refer to Galatians as Paul's mad letter, but it's really kind of him. He's full of passion. He's very, very passionate, very, very aggressive with some of his wording of things in this letter. And the reason is because, one, it was very early on and he was still a very young man. And one thing that I can identify about Paul, just in general, is that he was a very, very passionate person. Like before his conversion on the road to Damascus, he was a Jewish Pharisee, and he was very, very passionate about God, and so much so that he was willing to murder and persecute Christians just because he was that passionate about God. And if this is who God says he is, then this is what I have to do for him. Because Paul was actually following the rules, the law of the Old Testament. That was what the law, the Old Testament, said to do. If somebody claimed to be God and to blaspheme God, they were to be murdered. And so that's what Paul was doing. But then when he had this conversion, this moment on the road to Damascus, he changed his entire life. He spent about 9-10 years just studying the scriptures and just really diving into what God was and what this new thing really meant to him. But he was still just that passionate. And so that's actually to set up the story, we're going to set up our study in Galatians with Acts chapter 13, which is Paul's first missionary journey. So in Acts chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas are with the church in Antioch, which on this screen is down here. There's Antioch right there. So that's where they were at. And that was kind of one of the central hubs for Christianity in the early Christian years. And so they got a call from God in this meeting that Barnabas and Paul need to go to the Roman Empire and start preaching. And so that's what they do. And this is kind of what this map shows. They left Antioch and they went here to Cyprus, to this island, and they preached in several places around there. This is actually when Paul first starts being referred to as Paul. Up to this point, he'd actually been referred to as Saul, and we can talk about why his name changes some other time, but this is when that happens. And so then he works his way up here to the mainland, and he eventually gets up to Antioch Pisidia, which is in Galatia. And so this is the first time that he's preaching in the the region of Galatia. And while he's there, Paul and Barnabas are preaching at the synagogue, and all of these people are like amazed. They're like, wow, this is really great stuff. And so they start believing what Paul says, and they start coming, and like every night they preach, and people, more and more people start coming until the Jewish leaders actually start getting jealous, it says. And they actually end up running them out of town. And as they leave town, they leave from Antioch and they go to Iconium, which is right here. It's not marking, but it's right there. And once they're in Iconium, they start preaching again. And again, the Jewish leaders there, and probably some from Antioch Pisidia, start coming, and they start running them out of town. And they actually essentially get thrown out of town here, and they just kind of, says they shake the dust from their sandals and they walked away. And so they went to Lystra, which is just below Iconium right there. And here they start preaching, and they actually end up healing a man who was lame. He couldn't walk, and they end up healing this guy. And the people in Lystra start thinking that Barnabas and Paul are Zeus and Hermes. They actually think that they are the Greek gods, Zeus and Hermes. And so they start trying to worship them. And Paul and Barnabas are like, stop, this is not, we're just humans. What are you doing? This is not what we're here to do. And at this point, this mob from Iconium this angry mob ends up making their way to Lystra, and they actually stone Paul. Like earlier in Iconium, they tried to, and they got away. In Lystra, they actually catch him, they stone him to the point where they actually thought he was dead. It says they dragged his body outside of the city and just tossed it because they presumed he was dead. He then, wakes up, probably very sore, and, bloodied and bruised because rocks hurt. And him and Barnabas end up leaving, understandably so, Lystra, and they head over to Derbe, which is over here. And they start preaching there for a while, and then they end up making their way back through Lystra and Iconium and Antioch Pisidia before they work their way back to the church there in Antioch, which is this Antioch way down here. So, cool, Craig. That was kind of boring. I found it interesting. I'm sorry if you didn't. But anyway, so when they get back to Antioch, what happens is there's this group of they call them Judaizers, of Jewish Christians. And this is what it says. While in Acts chapter 15, verse 1, while Paul and Barnabas were at Antioch in Syria, some men from Judea arrived and began to teach the Christians, unless you keep the ancient Jewish custom of circumcision taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. So Paul and Barnabas are very much against this idea, and they start attacking verbally, not physically, but arguing with these people to the point where they actually, the Christians go, all right, Paul, Barnabas, Christians here in Antioch, let's go down to Jerusalem, we'll hold a meeting, and we're going to solve this thing. And so they actually gather all the Christian leaders in Jerusalem. Yes, this is just it sounds like something really boring that would happen today. And we're like, oh, church is so whatever. But this has happened 15 years after Jesus has died. This is starting to happen. There's already starting to be conflict. Humanity is starting to integrate into the church, into what Jesus was doing. And as you can see, humanity fails a little bit at times. And so while they're there, they're debating whether they should have Gentiles essentially be circumcised. Well, way back in Acts chapter 10, Peter had this vision of all this food that was clean and is supposed to be unclean, and that according to Jewish customs and traditions, this food was unclean. And in this vision, the Lord is telling him, eat of this food. And he's like, no, I would never do that. And God essentially says, man, I've done away with all that stuff. You can eat whatever you want. The Jewish customs, those traditions, those laws, Jesus came to fulfill those. They're past now. You are in a new age. And he actually is the first time any Gentile is converted to Christianity that we know of in the Bible. And so Peter has already kind of experienced this a little bit. And this is what Peter actually says. He gets up to the end of the meeting, and Peter addresses them, and he says, brothers, you all know that God chose me from among you some time ago to preach to the Gentiles so that they could hear the good news and believe. God, who knows people's hearts, confirmed that he accepts Gentiles by giving them the Holy Spirit just as he gave him to us. He made no distinction between us and them, for he also cleansed their hearts through faith. Why Are you now questioning God's way by burdening the Gentile believers with a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors could bear? We believe that we are all saved the same way by the special favor of the Lord Jesus. And so Peter's essentially saying, look, we couldn't uphold the law. When we couldn't do that, why are we trying to burden them with that when it seems obvious that God is not working that way, that God's not going about it that way anymore? And so then James, the brother of Jesus, who's kind of the leader of the church at this point, gets up and he says this. He goes, my judgment is that we should stop troubling the Gentiles who have turned to God. And so this is now what Paul has been arguing and fighting with these Judaizers about. And this is really what Galatians is going on in Galatians. Paul is trying to write this letter to these churches in Galatia and say, look, I know there's these Jewish Christians, these Judaizers that are going up there that are trying to tell you that it's got to be this way or no way at all. Like you either have to get circumcised or you're not really a Christian. He's like, but that's not what I taught you, and that's not what it's about. And we'll get more into that, obviously, as we dive into the book. But there's this battle between both Paul and these Judaizers, these Jewish Christians that are kind of teaching them the wrong way. But there's also this battle between sin and legalism, because Christianity, as Paul explains in Galatians, is right here teetering in the middle between one step too far this way and it's all of a sudden you're too far into sin, and one step too far this way and you're too far into legalism. And he's trying to explain to them and show them the balance that you have to have between both sin and legalism in order to truly understand what Jesus was all about. And so this is really where Galatians picks up, because it's interesting. Peter gets brought up in Galatians, and Paul calls him out. He calls him a hypocrite at a certain point, and puts him in his place, which is probably why Peter in Acts chapter 15 is standing up and defending what Paul has been saying, because Paul has already called him out on this once already. And so this kind of then sets us up to start our study in Galatians. It's weird to start the Bible study in Galatians without looking at one single verse out of the book of Galatians. But to me, I think it's really important to set the setting and let everyone to kind of understand what's going on in Paul's life, why he's saying exactly what he's saying, what's going on in the church in Galatia, what those Christians were going through, so that we can understand when Paul's saying these things, how are they hearing it and what are they hearing? And so I think it's really important to really set the stage to really understand, hey, why is Paul talking about this stuff in the first place?